Thank you for listening to this download of Start the Week, presented by Anne McElvoy.
Hello! Ever since Goethe's Faust strove to find out what holds the world together at its core, the ability of science to explain the mysterious has been a source of awe and wonder, but also some nagging anxieties about the price of that knowledge. So this morning, without the aid of Mephistopheles, we bring you 4 people whose work might well change our minds and our lives. Alison Woollard is a geneticist who's giving the Royal Institution Christmas lecture. Roger Kneebone is a surgeon who's keen to open up the hallowed operating theatre to our gaze. Kathryn Asbury is co-author of G is for Genes, exploring the impact of genetics on education. And Mark Elder conducts the Halle Orchestra, and he's busy rescuing some rarely performed opera. Alison, your lecture is about what happens when cells in living bodies transform into complex organisms, but it intrigued me that you've called your first lecture, or your series of lectures, The Life Fantastic. It sounds almost magical.
Well, we're going on a magical voyage through developmental biology, evolution and cutting-edge biomedicine, all in 3 lectures.
But when you say magical, I suppose I wondered there's a fascination there for you as well as your spirit of inquiry as a scientist.
Yes, I find the study of genetics is something that makes me feel about the world in a rather magical way. I think it really is fascinating and quite extraordinary to be privileged enough for humans to have evolved a brain that's big enough to start to understand the world around us.
And to tell us a bit more, in particular, I think your first lecture is delving into the way that cells reproduce and, in a sense, if you could use this word of cells, intelligence. How do they know what to do, and what does that tell us, perhaps, about other areas of biology?
Well, that's a question that's vexed developmental biologists for so long. And it's a really interesting one because we know just by looking around our bodies that all of our cells, we have about 40 trillion cells in the average human body, all of those cells do very different things. So our heart cells do very different things from our skin cells, for example. So cells must know what to do. And we know that cells know what to do because of the proteins they produce. And they produce proteins because of the DNA sequence that they have inside all of our cells. But the real conundrum is the fact that all of our cells contain exactly the same DNA, the same genome. So how is it that cells interpret this genetic information in different ways in order for cells to do the right thing at the right time in the right place?
And of course, they don't keep on just doing the same thing at the right time in the right place, do you? Because you also have what you describe as mutants, which sounded rather sci-fi. What do mutants tell us about cells and life?
Well, a mutation is a change in DNA sequence. So it's a change in the instructions that code for all the proteins that enable a cell to do what it needs to do. So a mutation can enable a cell to take on a different function. It can enable a cell to perhaps do something that it hasn't done before, or it could be really bad and cause that cell not to behave properly. So mutations, of course, can be bad, and we associate mutation with disease. But in terms of evolution, mutation is the driving force because it provides the variety on which natural selection can act to select those mutations that enable an organism to have a more competitive advantage in an environment.
And of course, there's a medical context and a practical application here. You're going to discuss cell therapy, gene therapy, organ transplants. We've already revolutionised treatments, but do we now stand on the edge of another big change in where we can go in enhancing or prolonging life?
We really do, because we have so much information at our fingertips. Sequencing genomes has changed from something that used to take a very long time into something that just takes a few days and eventually a few hours. So we have a huge amount of information at our disposal. And the challenge is now to process this information. There's still a huge amount of work to be done. You know, the average human gene, we really still don't know what it does. And we need to really unpick what genes are doing in order for us to then have new targets for new medicines and so on. So we have an enormous amount of information and we need to be able to process that information.
And what possibility most excites you? There's a lot of sense with this genetic medicine that we're always on the cusp of something, always on the brink. Mm. What do you look forward to, or what sort of entices you most about what might come next?
Well, I think that cell-based therapy is very important. So once we understand what makes cells do what they need to do, then we can start to understand how to make them do things that are different. So we can build the cells that we might need to treat a particular disease, like heart disease. But gene therapy is another one that, again, it always sounds like we're on the cusp, but I think there are some really exciting new tools for editing genomes very precisely that may mean that we're on the cusp of some really exciting medical advances where we can very safely and very precisely target mutations in us in order to repair them.
What would be a specific example of what that would help or possibly cure?
Well, if you take a disease like cystic fibrosis, for example, that's a genetic disorder that's caused by a mutation in a single gene. If you can engineer the cells of the lung to have that mutation repaired, then you have cured that disease in that person.
Roger, it does look like this is the sort of thing that could put you and the surgeon class out of business.
Yes, well, in some ways I hope it will put a lot of things out of business. But I think while I was hearing you talk, I was thinking that you're talking about where things start off with the genetic side of things. But as surgeons, I guess we're mostly dealing with what that's turned into, with people who are individuals and who have their own differences and variation. And we're obviously, when we look at people, they all look completely different, but people often don't recognise that the insides of people are subtly very different as well. And that's one of the things that affects us very much as surgeons. If you open somebody up, you know roughly that their liver's going to be on the right and their spleen on the left or whatever. But actually,
it's
when you
really
look at it in
good that
detail,
you reminded us of that.
Well, it's worth knowing, particularly if you're doing surgery, where these things are. But when you look at them in detail, you find that they're not at all like the textbooks, because there's quite a lot of variation. And as a surgeon, you really need to be aware of that, because if a particular artery is curling around a particular nerve in a different direction, or there are two instead of one, it's obviously really important to know that. And I think the idea of looking in great detail at people's phenotypic makeup, at what people are like both anatomically and also chemically, is very exciting. And the idea of being able to get far more information now than we ever used to have before is a really interesting new direction.
Alison.
It's very interesting, isn't it? In surgery now, it seems that as surgical techniques are enhanced, in a sense, the surgeon is more far removed from the patient, because they're using a lot of manipulation devices and microscopes and so on. And yet the patient is much more likely to be awake during the surgery.
Absolutely. I think this is a really interesting kind of paradox, because certainly when I was starting my surgical training, pretty much all big operations were done under general anaesthetic, and the surgeon opened somebody up and you saw what was there and you put your hands on people's insides. Now we're at the point where a lot of operations are done by wiggly wires introduced in one part of the body that actually act on somewhere completely different. So putting a wire in through somebody's groin and doing something on their brain or their heart. But as you say, the patient may well be awake because it's under local anaesthetic. And so there's, at the same time, a sort of sense of distance between the procedure and the performance, but a sense of closeness between the clinicians and the patient. And I think that's something that we need to come to terms with, because it's a very different way of doing things.
One other thing that I was interested in reading about your work, Alison, was the way that you take a quite liberal, generous view of serendipity, that it's not simply that you go out to find a cure or to find out how one thing works, but that along the way you might well find something else. There's an interesting example about how rats can tell us about ageing.
Yes. I mean, I think that's a very important concept in basic biological research, is that great achievement doesn't have any particular roadmap. You don't know how findings in basic biology are going to be applied to medicine. And I think it's actually quite important to have that attitude and not to go out to seek a particular cure for a particular disease. You don't just set the sat-nav
and set off to get there.
Absolutely not. Absolutely not.
But where has that been evident in your own work?
Well, a good example in the organism I work on, Cenorhabditis elegans, a tiny nematode worm that sounds very, very different from a human. So you might ask the question, well, why on earth would working on a worm help medical research? But a phenomenon called programmed cell death was first discovered in the worm, and that's the phenomenon of cells knowing that they've done something a bit bad and they ought to die. and it's a suicide mechanism. And this was thought at some stage to be an oddity of C. elegans development. We know that a certain number of cells at a particular stage are programmed to die. But it turns out that this is actually a very important process in humans as well. It goes on all the time. And it's cells in us that know that they're up to no good that go through this process of programmed cell death. So particularly important in cancer. So cells that have taken on some cancerous characteristics in us undergo this programmed cell death mechanism. And if programmed cell death goes wrong, then we're much more likely to get a tumour. And it turns out that the genetics, the genes that control this process in the worm, are very, very similar to the genes that control that process in us.
And once you understand more about that, you understand more about precancerous conditions and possibly what to do about them.
And you can start to target drugs at enhancing that.
Kathryn, let me bring you in. There's the importance of being open-minded and curious, this questing spirit that I think Alison's just described and embodies here. And yet there are problems, aren't there, in science when people don't like the sound of what you're looking at. You work on genes and education, and that's a classic area where people just get quite antsy about it. They don't even like it to be discussed.
Mm-hmm. It's very interesting, really, because when somebody like Alison talks about genes and medicine, people are very open-minded. People know they have relatives who become ill. They know they are likely to become ill. And they like the idea that there are major institutions and charities out there trying to find cures, trying to find ways of helping them live longer, healthier lives. But when you apply a word like genetics to something like education, people do get very upset. And I do have some sympathy for that kind of attitude because, you know, genetics has been misused in the past, and we're talking about children, and people care about their children more than they care about anything else. And we're talking about how we educate them, how as a society we nurture our young people. So it's a touch paper. I can understand why it upsets people. But what's very difficult is that Robert Plomin and I have just written a book, G is for Genes, and one of our reasons for writing it was to explain the science in a way that shows that all of the misconceptions and stereotypes surrounding it are not necessarily true, and that we've learned a lot about how children learn, and that actually if you can understand it, if we can explain it to you in a language that you understand, then it's possible that may be used to enhance education, and that we may be able to...
But also things change. I mean, it seems a particularly sensitive thing at the moment. There's so much kind of policy, ideology, and also just what parents want for their children tied up with what you do. But I think it was around the rest of the table that you must have had examples where things that are thought at some point, I think back to heart transplants or the first IVF baby, people didn't always say, wow, this is just great, this is an unalloyed good. They often have doubts about all sorts of things, which then change as information spreads and people get more experienced about it.
Well, I think there are always pros and cons, and I think nothing is ever as clear cut as the newspapers like to make it. No. I think your point about confusing or the idea of genetics having this strong emotional charge is a really good example. And in my own experience, I think the world of surgery is something that people are both attracted to and repelled by. And so a lot of the work that we've been doing around public engagement has been around making an apparently closed world available for people to see and perhaps take part in. So a lot of this is about demystifying things, and I think putting the issues out there so that people can discuss them. And I guess that's what you've been encountering.
Yes, very much so.
Mark, you wanted to come in.
I'm fascinated by what I read of your wonderful book. I'd like to read the whole thing, Kathryn, because it seems to me to raise enormous questions of how we can help children find their full potential. Yes. But isn't this going to require us to completely revolutionise the way education is presented to children, and particularly the role of teachers?
Well, I think the simple answer is that we don't know. For the vast majority of the book, what we're presenting is the kind of basic science that Alison has talked about. We're presenting what we know about heritability. And in the end of the book, we put forward some big ideas about how that could make, and we do talk about a fairly revolutionary approach to education. But the simpler message is that we think that because children differ in very profound ways, both genetic and social, we need to personalise how we teach them and how they learn. And that's what Alison is describing about cells and what Roger's describing about surgery.
Well, before we do that, Kathryn, could you just tell us heritability? You just threw the big H word there into the debate. What do we know about heritability and educational performance or aptitude?
Okay, I'm really glad you asked, actually, because it is a really difficult word that people don't always understand. People hear genetics and they think we mean determinism. Heritability is a population statistic. It tells you nothing about individuals. So if I say, for instance, that reading is 60 or 70% heritable, what I mean is that genes can explain 60 or 70% of the differences between children in how well they read. And I think reading is a really good example of it, because reading is, depending on the study, between 60 and 70% heritable. And people say, how can reading be genetic? It doesn't make sense. Because if you didn't expose children to books, if you didn't read them stories, if they didn't see letters, they would never learn to read. So in that sense, it's an entirely environmentally driven skill. But what genes do is influence how well children read and how easily they learn to read in relation to each other. So knowing that there's a genetic influence on that can help us to target resources at the children who struggle, I would hope.
And how do you come to this? Because another area of your research very much linked to this is working with twins, where you're able to take the same genetic material, but then you're able to look at the impact of environment or changes in life.
Yes, so the way we get our heritability estimates, I work with Robert Plomin on a large twin study. We invited all of the twins born in the UK between 1994 and 1996 to take part, and we followed them ever since they were born, and some of them have turned up at York University now, which is lovely. But identical twins share all of their genes, and non-identical twins share half of their genes. So if we find that identical twins are more similar in their reading ability or musical ability or scientific ability, then we know that genes are at play, because that's the defining difference between those two groups. So it's a natural experiment that allows us to calculate how much of the differences between people are influenced by genes and how much by nurture.
And did anything surprise you, if you take that line of genes going along to nurture, but anything surprise you on that journey?
There are lots of surprising findings in there. I think one of the most interesting for me is that genes seem to exert a stronger influence as children get older. So for a lot of skills, when children are toddlers or preschoolers, environment has a lot of influence, which makes some intuitive sense, because those children are spending a lot of time at home with their families, and family is making a difference there. But as they get older and go out into the world, their genes come into play more and more, which I think is really interesting. And the other thing that we found that's quite interesting is that the environments that seem to make most difference to children are the environments that are not shared by children growing up in the same family. So at the moment I'm doing a study funded by the Nuffield Foundation, where I'm talking in depth to identical twins who are all around 17 and 18 and their families, who are quite different from each other, and talking about the experiences they've had in their lives, because they have to be experiences that the two twins didn't share, that have led to that difference, to try and understand a little bit more about how nurture works and how nurture influences diversity, as well as how genes influence it.
Mark threw out the question at the beginning of talking about this, where he sort of said, well, what's the outcome? What do we do about this? And reading your book and also writing about education, I'm covering the PISA International League tables last week. One of the things that interested me was, when you know about the more distinctive nature of children and children's learning, how do you then fit that into an education system which has to deliver to a vast number of children, which can't simply personalise in the way that perhaps your research might suggest that we should?
Well, I think there are lots of ways of doing it, but one of the things that I think are a problem is that we don't have equality of opportunity. There are great swathes of children in our country who don't have the opportunity to fulfil their talents. There's a process called genotype-environment correlation, which means that our genes influence our experiences as well as influencing what we can do and how we do it. So I think finding more ways of putting children into different environments that allow them to fulfil their potential. I was thinking about meeting Mark today, and I woke up in the night thinking, El Sistema, the Venezuelan project that brings music tuition to children throughout Venezuela, primarily poorer children from difficult backgrounds, and how successful that has been. And it's that kind of initiative that allows the child who is perhaps from a very disadvantaged background but would be a wonderful cellist or opera singer or conductor, it allows them to be in an environment where that nature could be nurtured. And I think we have too little of that in our education system.
Mark, do you think that there is, as a musician, but you also work a lot with schools, you meet a lot of children, I think you teach some of them how to conduct on a first acquaintance, but all those hours of learning and practice, yet how much do you think is down to natural ability?
Well, I think that the role that music can play in the development of a child's life is something that is so inadequately understood. And it seems to me that the politicians generally, but perhaps many, many, many people, don't yet really want to draw on the natural given qualities about music that all children have. I'm a great believer in saying that everybody can sing. I really do believe that. And a lot of people will denounce that and say, no, you're probably right, but I can't. But actually, I believe that everybody could, if the situation is right. And it seems to me that music has a great role to open up children in other ways. And there is so much data now that shows that if children can be brought to music at an early age, it helps them with other subjects. It helps with their own creativity, their own self-confidence.
But you see, I think some people listening to that, I think, well, that's all very good. That's the generous spirit of enlightenment and sharing education and music. But that some people are just always going to come with a massive amount more ability. And therefore, the difficulty is about how you balance off what you're beginning to know about that and what you might want to do in terms of opening up music or other areas of education.
But it's only until you've offered the opportunity to all children that you can find out whether or not there's a big talent behind it or a minimal one. And one of the things I felt in reading your book was that I wasn't quite clear how far you need to go along giving the basics before you can understand the potential of a child in a much bigger context, much more into the rest of their life.
Yeah, well, one of the reasons when we were sort of playing with the ideas and how it might look in practice, one of the reasons we went for very, very large schools, it's not a practical solution, particularly in a time of recession, but one of the reasons was so that we could offer a huge amount of choice. So there will be some children who have ability in music and that should be nurtured and become a major priority for them. And there'll be lots of other children who can enjoy music and it can be a nice part of their lives, but they're never going to play for the Halle. But those children will have opportunities to do sport, to do woodwork, in a school that offers a great variety of choice to all children without cost or access to resources being an issue. I think Alison talks about blue skies thinking with cells. I think we need blue skies thinking about children. What can you do and how can we bring that out for you?
Alison, blue skies.
Well, I was going to say, I think one thing that's absolutely certain about heritability, and there's not many certainties about heritability, is its complexity. Mm-hmm. So there won't be a gene for being good at the violin. There won't be a gene for being dyslexic. There won't be a gene for being good at maths. The complexity is driven by the interactions of genes with each other and the interactions of genes with the environment. And scientists are adding new layers of complexity to that all the time. For example, we now know that our grandmother's diet is probably an important contributory factor to our own propensity towards diseases like diabetes. And so it's not just the genes that you inherit. We talk about epigenetics now. You inherit patterns of modification to those genes. Most of those modifications are wiped clean in early stages of development, but not all genes. So there do seem to be patterns that are passed through generations. So that adds another layer of complexity when we're trying to think about genetic determinism and heritability. Extraordinarily complicated.
Let's turn to Roger Kneebone. Roger, like Alison and Kathryn, I know you're very keen to open up your field of expertise and let the public into your domain, the operating theatre, which we might think of as being behind those terrifying swing doors when we go in for some treatment or other. What would be gained by opening it up?
Well, I think the operating theatre is a scary place. It's a very interesting place, and people tend to think of it as a rather exclusive place, which in a sense it is, of course, because most people can't go in, but that in order to be working as part of a surgical team, you have to be very scientific, for example. I'm thinking much more in terms of medicine in general and surgery in particular as a practice that draws on science. Of course it does, and science is a crucial part of what we do as clinicians, but also a practice that is a craft and a performance. I've been working a lot as a Wellcome Trust Engagement Fellow, exploring these connections between surgery and other forms of performance, working with musicians and dancers and theatre people, circus performers, and also other
I think you may
craftsmen.
have to explain how you combine working as a surgeon with circus performance.
Well, we talk about performing operations after all. We do surgery in an operating theatre. There's a long history of seeing surgery as a performance where you start something. Once you've started it, you've got to go through to the end. You can't stop in the middle and go back. And you're doing it in front of not thousands of people like Mark, necessarily, maybe only one or two, but nonetheless it is a performance. And I think we can learn a huge amount by making connections between a world that we're familiar with, in my case the world of surgery, and worlds that we're not familiar with, but who also have characteristics in common. And the performance is a very good example. Lots of discussions I've been having with musicians and theatre people, other performers, make it clear that very similar things are going on in those two worlds. And the same goes for craft. I've been working with...
But what are those things?
Well, for instance, the need to perform under pressure with something where the stakes are very high, where somebody... where bad things can happen if it goes wrong, but equally very good things can happen if it goes right. The need to work in a team, to be aware of what's going on with other people in your group as it's happening, and the need to communicate, often without words, with other people in your team, because after all you can't talk to people when you're on the platform of the Wigmore Hall playing in a string quartet. You very often can't talk to people very easily in the operating theatre because you're not looking at them, you're wearing masks. A whole lot of differences between normal life and what goes on in the operating theatre, and the same goes for the craft, the things that you do with your hands. And I think one of the mistakes we make, going back to the earlier points, is that if we present surgery as a science, then lots of people never think it's for them because they think they're not good at science. But actually, there are many things that can make you an excellent member of a clinical team. Being able to work with other people, being good with your hands, many other things that children don't even know about unless they get the opportunity to try it out. So the work we've been doing with simulation, with creating like little plays really, in science fairs and arts venues and out in parks in the middle of London, where we show operations done by real surgeons.
These are the pop-up theatres.
These are the pop-up theatres. This is sort of inflatable operating theatre, a movable enclosure where you can create a very vivid sense of a real operation. It's not a real patient. It's using models. Probably everyone's relieved to know that it's not a real patient, but it is real surgeons and real nurses, real anaesthetists and real other people. And so we invite people not only to
So I'm going to be a
watch.
bit basic, but do we get the kind of blood and guts
Yeah,
and gore?
loads of blood and guts.
Oh,
so
great.
one of them, somebody's
Right,
been
I'm there.
stabbed, you open them up, there's blood shooting up, hitting the light. It's actually from a blood pump, but it looks terribly realistic. Another one where we invite people to drill holes in the head with a group of neurosurgeons to see what it's like. And if you're 11, you've probably never had the opportunity to do that. Well,
No, I
almost
shouldn't
certainly
think
never
so.
had the opportunity
Well, I mean,
to do that.
you hope they haven't had the opportunity to do that.
And so this gives people an opportunity to see what it's like to be part of an actual team. Going back to Kathryn's point about the difficulties in experiencing something that the school system deprives you of or prevents you from accessing. I think this idea of opening up closed worlds and inviting people in has got enormous possibilities.
One thing I was very interested in, Mark, you were just looking like you wanted to have a word there, but there's a great bit in something that I think you've written before, Roger, about practicing tying knots with one hand when you were training to be a surgeon. So it becomes second nature. And I thought, well, this is so like a musician's preparation, isn't it?
Absolutely. There's so much parallel between our two worlds. We often, of course, talk about the best performances are knife-edge performances. Mm-hmm. And the ability to create something, within the case of an orchestra, a lot of people, but even in a smaller scale performance, to create something spontaneously without being able to talk is a very, very interesting parallel of human activity, because there are so many givens, aren't there, and yet so many things that could be different and could go wrong. And how when the team is different, how the result can be different, even though superficially it may seem to be the same.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, my understanding is you're playing a piece of orchestral music from a score, and in a sense that's the starting point. But it's a different orchestra each time, it's a different audience, it's a different day, it's a different moment. Rather like that with an operation, you're taking out half of somebody's colon for cancer or something. You know what the book tells you the steps are, but it's a different patient each time. As I said earlier, the anatomy is very often slightly different. You're working with a different group of people, it's a different moment. And so all the time you're having to work with a group of people collaboratively to do something that's unique.
Improvisation springs to mind, and you're interested in jazz improvisation, I think.
Yes, I'm very interested in jazz improvisation. I think improvisation is a word people kind of shy away from with surgery, because they don't like to think that their surgeon's going to be improvising, but actually...
Alison is exactly my response. I went for that little reassuring pre-chat,
yes,
and was told that there was going to be an improvisation.
Yeah,
what would you think?
I think I'd be quite worried going into theatre with talk of improvisation, but I think what you're talking about is having to respond very quickly to a change in the situation.
Or respond to something where you don't know the details. I mean, if you're operating on somebody for a planned procedure to take out something for a disease, then you kind of know what to expect. But if you're opening somebody up who's been run over by a bus, then you really don't know what you're going to find. But once you open them up and you find things, you know what to do. So you may not know that they're whatever it is has been broken and needs to be removed. But once you find that out, you click into a series of steps of something you've done many times before. And talking to jazz musicians in particular, I got a very strong sense that they might not know exactly where an improvisation was going to go, but it was based on years of practice of scales and harmony and all the rest of it.
Not just years, because you're interested also, I think, in the passage of decades and the need to rediscover and revisit periods like the 1980s, when surgeons didn't wear shoulder pads, but a very different era in many ways.
Well, I was particularly interested in Mark's work on reviving 19th century operas, because I've been doing work in reviving surgical opera, or documenting surgical operations that have now become almost obsolete. 30 years ago, if you had your gallbladder out, general anaesthetic, big cut under the ribs, the kind of operation I was talking about before, but now that's completely changed to keyhole surgery. So a whole series of ways of doing things that were once commonplace have become virtually vanished.
And what do we get by going back to them? I mean, they moved on for a reason, presumably.
Yes, but partly there may still be times when when a surgeon does need to open somebody up if there are big complications, and it may be that surgeons now have lost skills that once were taken as read. And there are also social ways of doing things, how people used to work together at a time when they would commonly work for decades in a stable team.
Mark, you're also in the revival business, particularly at the moment.
Yes. Well, I'm fascinated to try and adapt the way I work and the people I work with to reconstruct sounds and the world that the sounds originally came from, to find different forms of beauty.
But specifically, you're reviving opera that has been sort of lost, forgotten, or just neglected. Yeah. It's gathering dust. Tell us about that.
Absolutely. And on Sunday, I'm going to give the British premiere of a piece by a very famous composer, Jacques Offenbach, who worked for most of his life in Paris, wrote 96 pieces for the theatre, some small, some large. And he's a classic example of somebody who's very famous for a small number of pieces. If we think of Offenbach, what do we say? We think can-cans and Orpheus in the Underworld. Well, the piece I'm going to do is called Fantasio, and it's based on a play by de Musset. It's a very funny, slightly zany, romantic, sentimental, satirical play that he turned into this considerable opera. Now, it wasn't much of a success when it was first done, but the reason that a piece is a failure or a success is so dependent on so many other things, on where the society was at the time. Now, this is really interesting with this particular piece, because it's got a bit of satire against royal families, politicians, the way decisions about a country's future are being made. But it was written just after the Franco-Prussian War. And interestingly, Offenbach was born in Cologne, and at that time, Cologne and the Ruhr were part of Prussia.
They're part of Prussia. So he gets himself between the lines, really.
Yeah, exactly. And his fame in the 1860s in Paris was huge. But as a result of the French losing this war, he suddenly was a bit high and dry in Paris, and he wasn't so regarded, and he wasn't allowed to have his success. And back home, they thought he's left us and gone over to the other side and tried to be a star in a French world. So when he wrote this piece, which is big, it's a big-scale 3-act piece. A lot of his pieces are tiny. For few people, tiny little orchestras are sort of farce. He always wanted to aim higher. And at the end of his life, he wrote one of his most famous pieces, The Tales of Hoffmann, which is the last thing he wrote. And this piece is like on the way to The Tales of Hoffmann. And it's so gorgeous and so unknown. And I think taste, you see, plays a huge role in whether something is accepted, whether or not an audience is given what they think they want.
So you're beginning to answer my cynic's question, which is, well, it's not performed for a reason. Basically, it didn't make it through in the great genetic selection of operas that we do listen to. Am I wrong?
Yeah, because the reason that something is a failure is so multifarious. You could actually, it depends on how you do it. The cast right to bring this piece off. Personality and atmosphere plays an enormous role in success, in wooing an audience and grabbing them and making them be entertained, be moved, to laugh their socks off, whatever you're trying to do. And this work, Fantasio, is a gorgeous piece. I can't understand that it's never been done in this country. It's been done a bit in France, once in Germany, but decades ago.
It popped its head up a bit in the 1930s and then went away again, didn't it? But then, I mean, in fairness, some other works have done that, and some other great composers. A Handel opera for a while seemed rather dusty, and now you can't move for rather trendy stagings of Handel.
When I was young and I went to a Handel opera, and a man with a very high voice, a countertenor voice, sang, "I fought like a lion," you couldn't really believe anything about it.
Did he sing exactly like that?
Absolutely. Absolutely. It was a countertenor. And it's this question of getting the tone right, isn't it? And Handel now has become central. We've produced and trained and encouraged generations of Handel singers now. And the quality of Handel singing...
But we also don't mind the artifice as much now. And your very good example shows it, that we don't react as allergically as in an era of perhaps more realistic singing.
But that's and to do with quality in the way that it's done, rather than whether there's something inherently poor or wonderful about it. If you get the tone right and you get the style right, then you're presenting a package to a public. And I think it's the same with this French operetta. I mean, there are other French pieces that I would love to do, if we can bring this one off on Sunday, that I think people would enjoy. The beauty of the music, you see, we can just take it on face value.
But this is our theme of tastes and fashions changing, isn't it? And Kathryn, things that are thought to be accessible at one point then seem to be big no-nos at another.
Yes, I loved what Mark just said about different forms of beauty. I love the idea that education will look at children and see different forms of beauty, and they won't be required by government systems to make them all achieve exactly the same thing, regardless of who they are and how they're made up and what their background is.
In fairness, government systems do have to sort of deliver to a budget to a very great number of people.
They do, but I think we have a situation where teachers recognise individuals, but government doesn't, and maybe could more than it does.
Roger.
I was thinking about, while you were talking, Mark, I was thinking about lost operations. I've been working a lot with surgeons who were crucially influential in bringing in keyhole surgery around the 1980s, end of the 1980s. Looking back over it, looking inside people's bodies with small instruments has been around for over 100 years. But it wasn't until the 80s that the conditions were right, that there was new technology, there was a different way of looking at things socially. And so an operation that had been tried out a couple of times before never really worked until the time was right. And
so
it was
the idea
in tune with the times.
precedes the time you can deliver
exactly.
it.
So I think it's very much a question of what the circumstances are at the time.
one of the facets about this performance that I'm going to do on Sunday that is crucial in my search for beauty is the orchestra that I'm going to do it with. I'm going to do it with the Orchestra of the Age of Enlightenment. And they've been in existence for 25 years, and we're very close colleagues and friends, and we've done many, many different sorts of music together. Music that most people would think is not suitable for a period instrument orchestra to play. Now, this orchestra will choose the instruments that they bring. They will choose the sorts of bows that they bring to play this music, depending on whether the music was written. The clarinets and the flutes and the oboes...
Whether it was written or when it was written.
When. The principle is not to use an instrument that couldn't have been made at the time when the piece was written. And so you're trying to recreate the sort of orchestral sound world that would have been accepted in the 1870s. And this is a very, very different sound from the one that we would produce now in the 21st century. Sounds have got bigger. Instruments have got bigger. Sounds have got louder. Violin bows now, in order to make a lot of noise, are much heavier and longer than they would have been in the mid-19th century.
But you're not of the view then that a bit of updating might not go amiss, that acoustically we have different expectations now and you've basically got to bring it up to date?
Absolutely not.
That's me told.
No, absolutely not. I'm interested in the idea of how, in this particular case, for instance, with a French operetta that was written for the Opéra Comique Theatre, not a huge theatre, you need to find the lightness. You need to find a different team of sound world, a different team of people to produce it, singers who actually have the right feeling for the style, so that you can recreate the sort of world and not just assume that more recent is better and more appropriate because we now know things that we didn't know then. They were fine back then, and they were doing their best with what they'd got, and they produced beauty.
Well, there we must leave our discussion. Beauty, science, the arts and all the bits in between. Thank you very much to all my guests. Roger Kneebone is Professor of Surgical Education at Imperial College in London. Alison Wooillard's Royal Institution Christmas Lectures, Life Fantastic, are on BBC 4 at 8 o'clock from the 28th of December. G is for Genes is co-authored by Kathryn Asbury and it's out now, and Mark Elder is conducting Offenbach's Fantasio at the Royal Festival Hall in London. It's on Sunday evening. Next week, Tom Sutcliffe will be in the seat. He's talking strategy with Josie Rourke, Laurie Friedman and Dominic Lawson. But for now, thank you and goodbye.
There's more information about Start the Week on the programme's website. Go to bbc.co.uk, where you'll also find many more Radio 4 programmes you can download for free. Thank you for listening to this download of Start the Week, presented by Anne McElvoy.
Hello! Ever since Goethe's Faust strove to find out what holds the world together at its core, the ability of science to explain the mysterious has been a source of awe and wonder, but also some nagging anxieties about the price of that knowledge. So this morning, without the aid of Mephistopheles, we bring you 4 people whose work might well change our minds and our lives. Alison Woollard is a geneticist who's giving the Royal Institution Christmas lecture. Roger Kneebone is a surgeon who's keen to open up the hallowed operating theatre to our gaze. Kathryn Asbury is co-author of G is for Genes, exploring the impact of genetics on education. And Mark Elder conducts the Halle Orchestra, and he's busy rescuing some rarely performed opera. Alison, your lecture is about what happens when cells in living bodies transform into complex organisms, but it intrigued me that you've called your first lecture, or your series of lectures, the Life Fantastic. It sounds almost magical.
Well, we're going on a magical voyage through developmental biology, evolution and cutting-edge biomedicine, all in 3 lectures.
But when you say magical, evolutionised treatments, but do we now stand on the edge of another big change in where we can go in enhancing or prolonging life?
We really do, because we have so much information at our fingertips. Sequencing genomes has changed from something that used to take a very long time into something that just takes a few days and eventually a few hours. So we have a huge amount of information at our disposal. And the challenge is now to process this information. There's still a huge amount of work to be done. the average human gene, we really still don't know what it does. And we need to really unpick what genes are doing in order for us to then have new targets for new medicines and so on. So we have an enormous amount of information, and we need to be able to process that information.
And what possibility most excites you? There's a lot of sense of, with this genetic medicine, that we're always on the cusp of something, always on the brink. What do you look forward to, or what sort of entices you most about what might come next?
Well, I think that cell-based therapy is very important. So once we understand what makes cells do what they need to do, then we can start to understand how to make them do things that are different. So we can build the cells that we might need to treat a particular disease.
I suppose I wondered there's a fascination there for you, as well as your spirit of inquiry as a scientist.
Yes, I find the study of genetics is something that makes me feel about the world in a rather magical way. I think it really is fascinating and quite extraordinary to be privileged enough for humans to have evolved a brain that's big enough to start to understand the world around us.
And to tell us a bit more, in particular, I think your first lecture is delving into the way that cells reproduce and, in a sense, if you could use this word of cells, intelligence. How do they know what to do, and what does that tell us, perhaps, about other areas of biology?
Well, that's a question that's vexed developmental biologists for so long. And it's a really interesting one, because we know just by looking around our bodies that all of our cells, we have about 40 trillion cells in the average human body, all of those cells do very different things. So our heart cells do very different things from our skin cells, for example. So cells must know what to do. And we know that cells know what to do because of the proteins they produce. And they produce proteins because of the DNA sequence that they have inside all of our cells. But the real conundrum is the fact that all of our cells contain exactly the same DNA, the same genome. So how is it that cells interpret this genetic information in different ways in order for cells to do the right thing at the right time in the right place?
And of course, they don't keep on just doing the same thing in the right time in the right place, do you? Because you also have what you describe as mutants, which sounded rather sci-fi. What do mutants tell us about cells and life?
Well, a mutation is a change in DNA sequence. So it's a change in the instructions that code for all the proteins that enable a cell to do what it needs to do. So a mutation can enable a cell to take on a different function. It can enable a cell to perhaps do something that it hasn't done before, or it could be really bad and cause that cell not to behave properly. So mutations, of course, can be bad, and we associate mutation with disease. But in terms of evolution, mutation is the driving force, because it provides the variety on which natural selection can act to select those mutations that enable an organism to have a more competitive advantage in an environment.
And of course, there's a medical context and a practical application here. You're going to discuss cell therapy, gene therapy, organ transplants. We've already read
like heart disease. But gene therapy is another one that, it always sounds like we're on the cusp, but I think there are some really exciting new tools for editing genomes very precisely that may mean that we're on the cusp of some really exciting medical advances where we can very safely and very precisely target mutations in us in order to repair them.
What would be a specific example of what that would help or possibly cure?
Well, if you take a disease like cystic fibrosis, for example, that's a genetic disorder that's caused by a mutation in a single gene. If you can engineer the cells of the lung to have that mutation repaired, then you have cured that disease in that person.
Roger, it does look like this is the sort of thing that could put you and the surgeon class out of business.
Yes, well, in some ways, I hope it will put a lot of things out of business. But I think while I was hearing you talk, I was thinking that you're talking about where things start off with the genetic side of things. But as surgeons, I guess we're mostly dealing with what that's turned into, with people who are individuals and who have their own differences and variation, and we're